Hello again, and welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346, and today we're going to continue talking about persuasion. So we've talked a little bit about how attitudes can change, or how we process persuasive arguments, but now let's take a time to talk about some of the techniques that people use in order to persuade other people. There are three main ways we can focus on persuasion. We can focus on people's desire to be consistency between their attitudes and their beliefs, or their attitudes from one situation to the next. We can evoke what's known as the norm of reciprocity, where if people get something, they feel like they have to return the favor in some way. And we can also focus on some of the heuristics we've talked about throughout the quarter, such as similarity or familiarity. So let's first focus on maintaining consistency. One of the more popular techniques using this strategy is known as foot in the door. That's when you begin with a small request and then gradually progress towards larger and larger requests until you end up with the kind of initially desired request. People feel like after completing this first small request, they need to be consistent, and they'll keep continuing to perform these larger and larger requests until they end up doing the desired request in the end. So if you think about it, if someone was asked to perform this big request, they may not have done that in the first place. So a great example of this is with political campaigns. You may ask people to hand out flyers for a political campaign if they're interested in the candidate, and then slowly building up to, for example, going door to door and then maybe speaking at a rally. Another technique is lowballing. This is having someone agree to a specific term and then changing the terms of the agreement after the fact. So people feel like if they've already agreed to something, it's easier to just go with the flow rather than to kind of break the commitment that they've already made. So you see a lot of phone companies do this with agreements where you don't really read the fine print and some kind of other thing occurs. Sometimes you'll see this with introductory plans in cable television. They'll give you a low price, and then after the fact, they'll kind of jump up the price after a certain amount of time has passed. And additionally, we have what's known as bait and switch. This is when you advertise a low price for a product, but then when they arrive, the product is gone. And so you end up selling them a different product that has a higher price to it, a better product, but still people are paying more. This plays on the behavioral intentions of the customer. People go to a store, especially if they read an advertisement for a product that they want. People go to a store to buy something. And then when they get there and the product's not there, they still have this intention to buy something, so people just shift that attention to a different product. And lastly, we have labeling. This is where people can assign a positive trait, often positive, to a person that encourages subsequent trait-consistent behavior. So I might call my friend clean or tidy in order to try and get him to behave in similar ways, such as to clean up after himself or do the dishes, etc. People, if they're labeled in this specific way, again, are trying to maintain consistency. They think, well, if people are calling me this, then I should probably behave in tow, follow in suit. And this is also really effective when you use one of these traits or labels in front of other people. So I might call my wife a really generous and nice person, and because I'm calling her that in front of other people, she feels like she even more so needs to live up to these expectations. So that's focusing on maintaining consistency. We can also evoke what's known as the norm of reciprocity. One technique that does this is known as the door in the face technique. This is when you present a target with a large request, and then you back down to a much smaller desire, the initially desired request. So because you are initially asking someone to do something pretty strenuous for them, and then you make a concession, like, all right, if you're not going to do that, what about this instead? They also feel like they need to make a concession and then agree to do what you're asking them. So I have a bad habit of saying, hey, can I ask you a really big favor? And then following that up with a small favor, basically. So people feel like I've made a concession in the favor that I'm asking, so they in turn will make a concession for actually performing the behavior. So a more concrete example of this is I might ask a friend, hey, can you drive me to Chicago, for example? When they say no, I can then say, well, then at least can you drive me to the airport? And even though that's still an hour and a half to 2 hour drive, they may be more likely to agree to it because I've made a concession. We also have what's known as unfair exchange. That's when you do someone a favor and then ask for basically a bigger favor in return. but in some way, shape, or form, they can be labeled as equivalent. So I might buy lunch for a friend. We go to Taco Bell, I get a cheesy gordita crunch. I say, hey, I got this, I'll buy you lunch. And then next week, we end up going to a fancy seafood restaurant, and I say, hey, I bought you lunch the other day, you owe me lunch, and they end up buying me a seafood platter, very expensive. Technically, we're reciprocating, we're exchanging lunches, but one of them is a lot more expensive than the other. And lastly, we can focus on some of the heuristics we've talked about. So we tend to trust more similar others, we tend to trust things that we've seen before, we're more likely to be persuaded by similar others or familiar others. We trust people who are in charge, whether or not that's real authority or fake authority, like just wearing a lab coat. And we also tend to have more positive feelings towards things that are almost gone, that are scarce. I may not like, for example, a specific type of chocolate bar, but if it's limited time only, if it's about to run out, I'm going to be more likely to get it. This is kind of the thesis behind the McRib at McDonald's. I don't know if anyone actually likes the McRib, but they gravitate towards it. They buy it because it's a limited time offer. It's a scarce resource. People are more likely to purchase it because it's not around for very long. We also see some interesting ways in which people can be persuaded to behave differently. We see something known as mindless compliance often occur. That's when people just simply follow requests without deliberating. And sometimes it can be the norm to simply kind of go with the flow, not really question things. But sometimes we see that persuasion is not always effective. Sometimes we can see what's known as reactance occur. That's when a person may be asked to do something and they actively kind of work against it. They say, don't tell me what to do. I do whatever I want. I have free will. You can't persuade me. Great example of this is oftentimes you'll see individuals who are under the age of 21 actually drink more alcohol, wine, beer, liquor, etc., than people who are older than the age of 21. So simply the act of telling people that they can't drink encourages drinking behavior more. Oddly enough, you see that weaker arguments or weaker demands tend to stop people behaving in undesirable ways more. And then when people are extremely strong or extremely forceful about telling people what to do, that's when you see this reactance occur more often. Another way in which persuasion can fail is through a technique known as attitude inoculation. This is when people are actually taught some of these persuasion techniques, made people aware of how some of these persuasion strategies work, and then the persuasion ends up not working very effectively. So there's a lot of advertising back in the early 1900s focused on smoking, for example, trying to get especially kids to smoke or adults to smoke. Simply teaching people how these ads work, how these advertisements preyed on some of the heuristics we use, for example, people were less persuaded by them. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.